I've been thinking a lot about the Angelina Jolie Brad Pitt situation. And I made a video several weeks ago. It was called Toxic Women, if you want to look it up, where I actually get into dissecting some of the allegations that Angelina Jolie has made, because the stuff that she's alleging now in her civil lawsuit, it's about that famous September incident on the plane in which she's alleging that Brad Pitt got physically abusive with her and with the children. That I understand that that's making the news right now, but that information, or at least those claims on her part, have been out for a while. And several weeks ago, I did a video when some of the FBI documents pertaining to that leaked out as a part of this lawsuit, or this legal battle between Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. And so you can go and you can take a look at that video. Basically, where I came down in that video on the situation, in terms of my opinion of who's at fault or not, is that I think that they are both in their own ways, and I'm not trying to like split the difference or whatever, or do what people tried to do with the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing, where they said, well, look, they're both toxic. But I actually think that this could be a situation where they actually both had or have some significant issues. And I think that this is what I'll say though, I think that Brad Pitt has probably owned up to his and has dealt with it insofar as he has apparently quit drinking and is sober, and has talked about in interviews before that I've read since the separation, and from Angelina Jolie, has talked about how he had some big issues, and to me indicated in some interviews that he did that he recognizes that he is at least partly and significantly to blame for what happened in the marriage. And so I talked about in the video that I did several weeks ago about how I think that it is not inconceivable that actually he did reach a kind of a breaking point, was blackout drunk on that plane, and might have done something abusive. Now, do I think that Angelina Jolie is probably blowing it out of proportion? I do think so. I think Angelina Jolie, I've read a couple of biographies about her. I think that she does suffer from borderline personality disorder, and of course we understand the distorted, delusional, and self-protective thinking that that disorder entails. I don't, though, from reading her biography, get the sense that she's a malevolent figure like Amber Heard. And I think that probably what's going on with Jolie is a kind of almost a Freudian repetition compulsion, and other people have noted this, of what happened with her own parents, where they had an acrimonious split, and then the mom sought to alienate the children from the father, which succeeded for a long time. Now, that's just my reading of it, and, from the little bit that I've read. So what do I think about what happened on that plane? You can look at the video that I put out to get more of my perspective on that. But I think that probably it was a combination of Angelina Jolie having been, as Brad Pitt put it, crazy, or having in a lot of ways really driven him insane over the course of their marriage, and him having a significant alcohol problem and an anger problem, which he does, if you kind of read between the lines of some interviews that he's done, he does allude to. And so, what do I think happened? Who knows? But I think that probably there was some fault on both sides. Now, do I think that Angelina Jolie is now milking it for all it's worth, or that, even in the face of Brad Pitt being a changed man and being sober and whatever, that she's, and having been, yes, like monitored and investigated by child services and all that, do I think that she is now blowing this out of proportion, or is seeking to capitalize on this now by airing this dirty laundry? Yeah, I think that's very likely, and it's not good, right? It's not. But anyway, but here's what I want to get at, okay? You can go to my past video, or you can go to other channels for a dissection of the ins and outs of this situation between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. But I want to think about the deeper implications for a moment, putting aside what may or may not have happened on that plane, or who's completely, if someone's more at fault than the other or whatever, putting all that aside. I have often felt when I think about the disintegration of Brad Pitt's marriage to Angelina Jolie, and then also when I think about the disintegration of his marriage to Jennifer Aniston, when he left Jennifer Aniston for Angelina Jolie, I've always kind of felt this, and then since then, as Brad Pitt has given interviews, he's like 60 years old now, right? Which I'm not saying that's super old, but like he's well on this side of middle age now. Like he is getting into the more retrospective period of life. where you're looking back and you're assessing and you're taking note of what you've done well, what you haven't done well, what worked out, what didn't work out, all of that, right? Excuse me. Which is something that we should all be doing, I think, anyway. But it tends to happen a lot more as somebody crosses into the senior citizen range, for lack of a better word. And I know it seems completely insane to even be thinking of Brad Pitt as a senior citizen, because look at, what great shape he's in and everything, right? So no, I'm just saying, though, he's getting toward that, right? Isn't senior citizen 65? Okay. Don't alienate anybody. I know that's I'm in my early 40s, and so I know the feeling of, gaining in the years and being so, I understand why it is that, my mom hates it when people assume that she's a senior. And she is a senior, but when they assume it, it's damn it. She does look much younger than her age, though. Actually, I think my mom, she's in her early 70s. I think she could still pass for late 40s in a certain lighting. And I say that with affection, and she would love that, right? Now, she is very young looking for her age. We're all vampires in my family. No. We also take really good care of our skin. Check out my skincare video that I did a long time ago, and you'll see all the skincare stuff I'm into. Okay, but back to the topic at hand. When I look at someone like Brad Pitt, who, as I said, is getting more to the other side of life, nearer to the end than the beginning, probably. And I think about the fact that he leaves behind him a string. Well, can we say that 2 failed marriages is a string? But maybe say a sequence, a couple of failed marriages, kind of busted up relationships with his children, which again, I don't know if that's because he really was abusive at times, or if Angelina Jolie has turned the kids against him, or if it's a combination of both. I think probably the truth is somewhere on the spectrum, right? But I think about what that feeling must be like, because here's the thing. I have never been married. I'm in a long-term relationship that means the same thing to me, but I've just, for various reasons, growing up with parents in a miserable marriage or whatever, I've never chosen to make that legal commitment. And I have not had children. I'm not going to have children, so far as I know. And so I look at that, and sometimes I think that as much as those choices might be an expression of just who I genuinely am, and there's nothing wrong with those choices. They may even be the best for me. I also do wonder sometimes if part of the reason why I've avoided some of these milestones is because I don't want to look back at my life and see a wreck of a failure of broken marriages, like basically what my parents, and no offense to my parents, because my mom will be watching this, right? And she'll understand what I'm saying. But the feeling, and I know this feeling she's expressed to me before, of sadness and of almost a sense of pointlessness when you look back at your life and you see that these things that you wanted to do so well, you wanted to have a good marriage, you wanted to have a successful marriage, you wanted your kids to turn out a certain way. And what is it like to, or you wanted your relationship with your kids to turn out a certain way maybe, and what is it like to look at your life and to see what appear to be very massive failures in those departments? And I'm speaking, and so what I'm saying about myself, avoiding, having kids, avoiding getting married, sometimes, and some other things that are marks of adulthood, sometimes I look at that, I avoid certain commitments that are marks of adulthood. And sometimes I look at that and I think, am I really just trying to avoid having to look at what I see as the shipwreck of a life behind me where everything is all busted up and out of sorts? Because it does seem like that is the experience. And correct me if I'm wrong, okay? I'm not trying to be depressing. But it really does seem that is the experience of most people when they look back at their lives from any vantage point, from middle age or from older or at the end of their lives, when they look back and they see, all of these things that were important to them that didn't work out. And I understand that there are plenty of cases where people look back and they see a lot of things that did work out. And maybe this just gets back to my own fucking problem with seeing the glass half empty too much, or depression, or whatever you want to call it. But I have to say that I do think there is some legitimacy to asking this question, which is, when Brad Pitt, in an existential philosophical sense, okay, when Brad Pitt looks back at his life, and I'm speaking more about him because I feel like he's been more candid in interviews than Angelina Jolie has been, which that might tell you something there. I don't know. But anyway, but when Brad Pitt looks back at his life, and he sees these busted up relationships with his kids, the busted up first marriage, a lot of broken engagements and long-term relationships along the way, busted up marriage with Angelina Jolie, Jennifer Aniston, you know, I detect in interviews that he has done a sense of a kind of an existential weariness and almost an existential, how do I want to say this? A deep existential disappointment and sadness that he looks back at his life and that he sees all of these kind of just loose threads that haven't tied up right. And I'm not just talking about him here. I'm talking about so many people. And I'm talking about myself as well, because even though I may have avoided, you know, getting a divorce or avoided having a relationship with my child go sour, or my child, you know, go off on the wrong path, and then I have to ask myself, was it my parenting or whatever, right? Like, I want to talk about, at some point I want to talk about the Jeffrey Dahmer series in more depth, because, you know, when I first started watching that series, I thought it was boring. The first episode, to me, it was kind of somnambulent. But then I realized as I got deeper into it that they were trying to present that as a sense of him like being almost a zombie, right? That he's kind of like just going through life like in this sort of basic, primitive, distorted state, numbed state, right? Where the only thing he can make him do to himself, the only way he can make himself feel something is to kill people, right? But anyway, but a lot of that series focuses on his relationship with his father and about his father's attempt to make sense of the fact that one of the most important things that you're supposed to do in life, you know, raise your child well and help your child to turn into a successful, well-adjusted human being, that he fucked that up royally. Now, I'm not blaming Jeffrey Dahmer's dad for the totality of how Jeffrey Dahmer turned out. It could be something just basic in the wiring, which is what Jeffrey Dahmer seemed to think. So I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that there are so many parents I know, and I'm not a parent, but you parents out there, I feel your pain on this. There are so many parents out there who, you know, they have been through the ping pong game of life, and they've been very beat up by it. And because that's what life is, it is hard, and it is being like you know, kicked back and hit back from one thing to another, and things that you didn't see coming from certain directions, and you're having to deal with all of that. And under those circumstances, you know, life, I've said this before, life is like going through a wind tunnel. You've got all of this stuff that's blowing at you, and you're just trying to figure out what to hold on to, or what to do, or what to make sense of, right? What to focus on. And I have so much sympathy for parents. And I think this is the majority of parents, you know, I think all parents understand this, maybe, who are just trying in their lives to just get through the wind tunnel and just get through another day, or just to do the best they can. And yet they look back, and from the perspective, from the supposedly 2020 perspective of hindsight, they see where they failed their kids, because everybody fails their kids, because the nature of life is failure. Yes, the nature of life is also success, but that's the dichotomy, that everything that we do will have some success in it and some failure, and that it's a spectrum. And here's what I'm trying to get at here, and I'm going to get back to Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt in a moment, okay? But this is the point I'm trying to make, is that in an existential, and bear with me because I know I'm not being very eloquent, but I'm trying to take things that I can just barely put into words and enunciate them, and yet they are things that we all know intuitively, and it is this. We want our lives to be a shiny work of art. We want our lives to have a symmetry. We want to look at our lives and see success. We want to look at our lives and see a good story. A good story in the sense of, this is where this character began, and then they progressed, and they did this interesting or helpful thing, or they helped this person, or they raised this child that would end up to contribute to society, or whatever, right? And we all have that fantasy, and I don't know if it comes from growing up in a media infused culture, you know, where we where we get this sense that we should be living out some kind of a great story, or if it's just innate, it's just our desire to make something beautiful or successful or correct out of our life. And the problem with that, it is such a great aspiration, but the problem with that is that everyone fails. And I'm not saying that everyone fails at everything, but I'm saying that like I said earlier, everything that we do in life is infused with both failure and with success, because that is the nature of life. Life is the dichotomy between opposites, all contained within the one. And so there is no parent who hasn't failed. And yes, I mean, you can look at some kids that turn out a certain way, and everybody seems to agree that that's success. Well, I would say, first of all, we don't ever entirely know what's going on with someone, but I understand that there are outcomes, whether it's our marriage or our businesses or our kids, there are outcomes that are more optimal than others, right? And for instance, having Jeffrey Dahmer as your son, having your son turn out to be a serial killer, that's not an optimal outcome. I think we can all agree. But what do we do? This is my question, and this is the feeling that I get when I read interviews with Brad Pitt. Not so much Angelina Jolie, although, well, let's just say, not so much with Angelina Jolie, but with Brad Pitt, you do see a kind of a real reckoning with who he is and with mistakes he's made. And I'm not saying that that's conceding any kind of abuse to his children, because he's never done that, and I want to be clear on that. He did give some interviews. I talked about this in my last video. He did give some interviews after the separation in which he did seem to take on a lot of culpability for his alcoholism, for, he said in one interview, an unreasonable and damaging emphasis on getting justice in his life. In other words, having people treat him how they're supposed to, and being very sensitive to injustice. To me, even kind of leaning toward the fact that maybe he has some issues with people, if he thinks he's not being respected enough, right? I don't know. But here's the main thing that I get from these interviews with Brad Pitt is just this sense of like how to pick up the pieces or deal with the brokenness of one's failures, whether they are ultimately one's fault or just the result of poor decisions that one made. There were probably a lot of people who could see that there were red flags with Angelina Jolie, and probably there were a number of red flags that Brad Pitt saw, and vice versa as well, perhaps, right? And were ignored, and we know why they were ignored, because Angelina Jolie, she was gorgeous and she was exciting. I'm sure she was great in bed. All of these things. I mean, it's not a mystery, and these things are not illegitimate either. This is what relationships are made of. I always, when people say things like, I understand, like, people can have problems with, like, sexual compulsivity and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that, like, sex is the most important thing or anything like that. And I think everybody has the right in their relationships to determine what their priorities are. And so some relationships could be very healthy with a very low sex emphasis or no sex. But where I'm going with that, though, is that I'm always sort of like irritated when people say things like, oh, well, he left her because he left his wife because this other woman, like, she was really hot and they had amazing sex and they, had all these like passionate feelings for each other, all that shit that no one cares about. And yes, I understand what they're trying to say with that. I understand that phase doesn't last very long and that you need to be in a relationship for deeper things if that's what you want, and for raising children and all of that, and for life. I get all of that. But I'm just saying, it's funny to me how people are so often in a judgmental way, so quick to sort of shrug off things that actually are fundamental aspects of romantic relationships, It's just sexual attraction. It's just passion. It's just basically the thing that makes people feel this romantic connection, but whatever. Anyway. So Brad Pitt, I think, probably made a mistake in choosing Angelina Jolie. Now, I'm not saying that he should have stayed with Jennifer Aniston, because I don't know what that relationship was like. But yeah, in hindsight, probably Angelina Jolie not the right choice, and maybe vice versa, right? So, but what do we do though? What do we do when we look at our lives and we see all of these failures in things in things that were really important to us, perhaps? And it doesn't just have to be commitments like marriage or kids. It can be whatever. We all measure our success, the success of our lives, and we all measure our sense of achievement or fulfillment or whatever in different ways. But something fundamental that we all have to deal with is looking at our lives and wanting so badly, some of us, to see a nicely sewn up garment instead of something with a bunch of ragged threads hanging everywhere. And that is what life often is. Maybe always. And I don't know anyone, even like the most successful human being, I'm sure they exist, okay? And you can tell me in the comments if you know people like this, but I don't know anyone personally who has gotten to the end of their life, either in old age or at death, and has not had major regrets about all of these loose, raggedy ends in their lives. They want to look at their lives, and we want to look at our lives, and we want to see a beautiful tapestry of perfection and meaning and maximization of everything that we could have done and been and all of that. And instead we're given this raggedy, first year sewing class project. And that's what we see when we look at our lives. Busted up marriages, relationships, whether friendships or with romantic relationships that seemed full of so much promise and then self-destructed, either because of personal flaws or weaknesses or just because we didn't have time. It got crowded out by other things. Look at my video about how to make the most of your time. All this stuff is under the philosophy playlist that I did, I think. But how to make the most of your time. Managing time, and I'm terrible at it, but managing time is one of the primary challenges of life, and nobody can tell you what takes precedence. Nobody can tell you what ask Tom Brady and Giselle. How much time should Tom be devoting to football? Well, you're gonna get different answers, and guess what? There's no arbiter to tell you what the right answer is. And maybe there's not even a right answer. What if all answers are right in some ways and all answers are wrong? I'm getting deeply metaphysical here, but this is something that I've been talking about for a while in my videos. Sorry, just looking at messages. Speaking of the wind tunnel, constantly getting messages. It's not made any easier by email and text messaging and all of these different WhatsApp and all this bullshit. Okay, I'm so tired of just having stuff just constantly. And I know I asked for it too, but none of us can really escape it, right? In some ways, the Unabomber, yes, he definitely should not have killed all those people, okay? But the Unabomber, he was onto some things in his manifesto. Anyway, that shouldn't be the takeaway from this video. The Unabomber was onto some things, So what to do? What to do when we look at our lives and we see all these loose ends, all this busted up shit? And here's what I want to say to you, I guess. And I don't know. I don't have any special insight. I don't know for sure. But my feeling is that in a higher metaphysical or spiritual sense, and I understand a number of people don't believe in God, don't believe in spirituality, so, take from this what you will. But I do think it's very likely that in a higher metaphysical or spiritual sense, what we are unable to see from our limited perspective here, or stuck in our limited lives on this earth, is that failure is not some unexpected, eruption. It's not some bug in the system, right? It is a part of the design, and it may even be one of the points of life is to experience failure. In fact, it may even be that the insights that we get, the revelations that we have when we look at our lives and we take stock of the wreckage, it very well may be that those are deep, important spiritual insights that could not be gained any other way. And that, in fact, the things that we see when we see the busted up relationships and the problems and the failures is we're seeing part of the life that we were meant to live. And I know that there's a lot of people who might have a problem with that, who might take offense at that and just say, okay, so you're saying that God wanted me to get this painful divorce from my husband, or God wanted my husband to cheat on me, or me to cheat on my husband, or God wanted, my kid to struggle with all of these problems or whatever. You're telling me that? Maybe. How else to explain it? Because when you think about, and I'm not a Christian, and I don't subscribe to any particular religious belief. You know, if you want to know what my beliefs are, you can look at the video that I did, Why I Believe in God. But I don't subscribe to any particular religious belief. And I think, though, when you look at the creation story in the book of Genesis, right? And I've talked about this before, but think about what's going on in that creation story. In the beginning, you have just God, right? And then God says, let there be light, and there is light. And then, so you have the differentiation. The first act of creation is to differentiate light from dark, is to split things into a dichotomy that is oppositional and yet is all one because it comes from the same source, God. So it's like the yin and the yang, right? Okay? Separate, oppositional, but one. Now, it is not without significance. And I don't care if you really believe in Genesis or not. I don't actually believe in this as a literal story, but as a kind of an allegory for deeper realities. And this is where I think we can find the significance and the pertinence of religion, is the deeper truths that we find in it, just like deeper truths we find in Shakespeare or whatever. But the fact that the initial act of creation, the founding act of creation, is to create an extreme opposition and dichotomy, light from dark, that tells you everything you need to know in some ways about this experience, this life, which is that God designed it to be a kind of, perhaps God designed it to be a kind of a wrestling, not only an enjoying of the light, but a wrestling with the dark. And part of that is failure. Part of that is committing failure and wrestling with failure. Now, when you think about the idea of original sin and you think about the fall of human beings, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, I know that probably most of us know this story. Initially, the book of Genesis indicates, it takes great pains to indicate that initially Adam and Eve and God are one, in the sense that there's no disharmony, there's no death, there's happiness, there's no problems. And it even says that God walks with Adam in the cool of the evening shade or whatever, right? So everything is unified, and earth is a paradise. Everything is very cohesively one. And we are one with God in a way. Now what happens is, God says to Adam and Eve, you can have everything that you want, you can have everything that you see here, all of this is yours, perfection is yours, whatever, right? But there's one thing you cannot do. You cannot eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, here's what I want to say, okay? I got into this in more detail, I think, in the video I did on Jason Momoa's divorce, but here's what I want to say. If you take the Bible at its word, or if we look at the Bible for a consistent depiction of God, it's very clear that God is almighty, you know, all these things that the Christians like to say, omnipotent, omniscient, you know, all of that. So what we're to understand, I think, is that God puts the tree there knowing full well that the humans are going to break the rules. That, of course, if he says you can have everything you want, but just this one thing, what are they going to go for? What do we always go for? The one thing that we're told we can't have. And it's so arbitrary, too. Why make it just one? Why not 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Is there really only one rule that God cared about them not breaking? No, it's because the one, one is representative of the fact that one is all you need. Because one option is all you need to break something, right? Let me put it this way. They only needed this one option to defy God, right? Because it is so inevitable. It is so a part of the way things were set up. And God, if he were truly omniscient, if he were truly all-knowing and all-powerful and all of that, he knew that that sin was not, that sin and evil and suffering were not bugs in the system. They were not things that just happened and popped out. They were part of the design. Where did Lucifer come from? You know, if you believe in that, right? It came from God. God created him. Evil comes from God in some way or form, either directly or as the byproduct of good, because in this dichotomous universe in which we live in, everything has its opposite. Everything has its counterbalance. And you could even argue, as I have before and many others have, that out of destruction comes creation. So God wanted, at least according to this biblical story that so many people believe in, God set human beings up to fail. He wanted them to fail. Do you hear what I'm saying to you? Life is set up for you to commit failure. And so many people, and that's not all it's set up for, it's also set up for the opposition, for success, for happiness, for fulfillment. But so often, this is what I'm trying to say to you, we look at our lives and we see the failures, and it's almost as if we want to take a big red marker, like maybe our teachers use when we were in elementary school, and we just want to blot out the whole thing, because what else can you say but that it's fucked? Now, that's a depressing view, I know, for a lot of people, and I keep making these videos, and we'll see how many people I keep turning off with these hard truths, but I'm actually trying to be optimistic, because what I'm trying to say to you is, if you can, and look, when I say make peace with failure, I'm not saying make peace with failure like, oh, I'm just going to stop trying. Oh, thanks. You said that it's part of the design for me to be a shitty parent. Great. All right. Or for me to cheat on my wife or whatever. No, I'm saying that we are meant to wrestle with these things. And that it is beyond me. I do not have the intelligence nor the information, and neither do any of you, to assert that failure negates the meaning of life, or that failure, or that looking at your life and seeing failures just means that your life is just one big trash can. And I understand that there might be limits to that way of thinking. Am I trying to say that Hitler's failures were great and God's just great with that? That's beyond me, okay? But I am trying to point out here that there are a lot of people who are stuck in their failures and have a sense of futility about life that is sapping the energy out of them, or that is consuming them with guilt, eating them up with guilt, because they think that they had this one grand shot at this beautiful, nicely sewed up trophy of a life. That was a lot of metaphors to mix there, but anyway, and they blew it. And now it's all ruined. This term ruined, this is interesting, because in pre-20th century, well, even into the early 20th century, I guess. But for hundreds of years, the term ruined meant, like in English vernacular, one of the meanings of that was that a woman had had premarital sex. We know that a lot of people have had premarital sex, it's not like a new modern day invention, but there used to be, generally speaking, more significant social strictures about it, especially toward women. And so there were periods in history, for instance, if you look at 19th century Europe, America, whatever, there were periods in history where if a woman had premarital sex, they said she was ruined, and it would be very difficult for her to marry or to marry in an adequate station, because people look at her as if, ugh, she's ruined. She's already been fucked, so cross her off the list, right? And what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of people who look at their lives and they see ruin. And what I'm trying to say to you is, first of all, that is generally for most people an inaccurate view. That if you look at your life fairly, you'll see a lot of times where you did the right thing, or where you made the right choice, or where you did stick it out or help somebody or whatever, right? I do think that most people actually are going through life doing the best that they can. They may fall short because we're fragile and frail and we got problems, but I'm just saying, and this is where I'm getting back to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, because I look at them and I think, what is it like to look back? Since I've never been married and I've never had kids, what is it like to look back, or for anyone in that situation, to look back and to see all of this wreckage? It's surely not what either of them wanted in terms of this ideal family life that they envisioned. And in fact, one of the things that's so interesting to me about Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's marriage and this creation, their attempt to kind of create this large idyllic family, is that it seemed like both of them were actually very wrapped up and invested in this kind of fairy tale of this family life. And, when we think that we can make a fairy tale of our lives, and we fall short, what I'm trying to say is I'm not sure we need to beat ourselves up so hard about that. Maybe beating oneself up is not even the right thing. You know, you take stock, you make changes where needed, but we are all living in the wreckage of our lives and other people's lives. You know, every victim is a victim of someone else, that sort of thing. And we are all trying to claw our way through the wind tunnel, grabbing onto as much as we can while not being completely knocked the fuck over. And look, if you're like me, and I don't care how much money you have, this applies to anyone, Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt, whatever, but no matter what your economic station or situation, I think probably most people are like me in the sense that when you look at your life, you feel you want so many things to be different, but so many of us are really just trying to keep from getting knocked over in the wind tunnel. And I have so much compassion. I try to have compassion for myself, but I have so much compassion for other people out there, because it is true that really everyone is often in life just feels one or two steps away from oblivion, from just giving into it all. Whatever that means for them, or throwing in the towel, or just looking at all of the loose ends of life and saying, meaningless, pointless, ruined. And I just want to say to you, I just don't buy that view of life, that because we have failures, even perhaps significant failures, that the way to look at that is to look at it and say, ruined. And if that's your view, if you are laboring or suffering under the guilt of prior mistakes, or suffering under this nagging sense of a missed destiny that you could have had if you hadn't just fucked it up, I would challenge you to let go of that and do the best with the information that you've got moving forward as much as you were able. And I think that it is in that wrestling. It is in that wrestling with life, and indeed in that wrestling with God. You know, in the old sense of, was it Jacob wrestling with God, or wrestling with the angel of God, or whatever? I think that there is something in that. You know, I had some people, I bring this up about wrestling, because I had some people come to my door earlier. I think maybe they were evangelicals, but they asked if they could share the gospel and if they could pray with me. And I said, well, I know the gospel very well, but I'm not going to turn down anyone praying. And so I went out there, and here's the thing, like, I don't subscribe to Christianity. I don't subscribe to any particular religious belief, but I had been really struggling this morning with just this question of how to deal with, how to think about God, or how to think about life when there's so much ugliness and there is so much failure, and there's so much that I look at and it just doesn't make sense. It feels like we've been put in a game that we were destined to lose. And I had this feeling, you know, that I have so often of really of feeling this great conflict, you know, with the idea of God and life and meaning, right? So anyway, so I went out there and I let them pray for me for a minute or so, just as a kind of a nice overture, because, you know, why not? If someone wants to pray for me. Is that a Freudian slip? Pray for me. I'm not going to turn that down. And, you know, maybe it was just coincidence, but the thing that they didn't even pray a prayer about Jesus or anything like that. The thing that they prayed for, they said, the guy who was praying for me, he said, it comes to me right now that you have been wrestling with God, and that you feel that God is displeased with you for wrestling with him. And he said, I'm feeling that God would say to you now, I want you to wrestle with me. I want to wrestle with you. I want to wrestle with you over this, over the meaning of this, over what you think and feel and how it appears to you. I want to be in there with you. I'm not offended by that. This guy said that, and then he wrapped up the prayer. And you can say it's mere coincidence, but I swear to God, it's another of those Jungian synchronicities that was exactly what I had been thinking about and wrestling with. And so here's what I want to say to you. Whether or not that whole experience that I just had outside was real, or whether it was just coincidence, this is what I want to say. I do believe that life is far more about wrestling with the problems of life than it is about building some shiny, gleaming ivory tower. Because you're just not going to be able to do that. But you know what? When you give up that dream, then maybe you can really discover some of the peace and the joy of life. Because it's there even in the failure, and sometimes especially so. All right. Thanks for watching me. I'll end on this note before I start crying. And I appreciate, as always, your views and your support. If you want to see more videos like this, check out my channel, particularly the philosophy videos. But I talk about this deep stuff in a lot of them. And I do appreciate your support. Any tips are appreciated. If you got anything out of this, my PayPal, Patreon links are below. And you just need a credit card, no membership or whatever. Anyway, y'all have a good day. Bye-bye.